So this video is an exercise in keeping the type or archetype the same, but then changing other factors. Since I've done the evil versions of the 16 personalities in a video, and feel free to check that out, I figured that I should do the heroic versions as well. This video is almost what you'd do if you were trying to write a heroic or protagonist version of each type and wanted a blueprint to base it off. ESTP, the fighter. This name sounds oversimplified, to the point of being unfair. I think it does capture the essence of the ESTP approach to things. It has nothing to do with physically fighting, or even to do with verbally fighting, or being aggressive. It's about their mindset and approach to dealing with problems. They take things one battle at a time. When I think of real-life ESTPs, Winston Churchill is one of the first people who comes to mind. He's a flawed person in many ways, but for that singular moment in history, it's hard to imagine any other person, be they real or fictional for that matter, who could have been a better figurehead and leader. His philosophy was simple. We're going to fight indefinitely, regardless of the outcome. Such a straightforward idea, but when it's said by someone who has the will to live by it, it's astonishingly powerful. That mindset characterizes the ESTP archetype, grounded in the moment, focused on what's in front of them, and in the most direct way possible, moving towards what they want. With every battle, they grow in power, confidence, and experience. Just like a hero, dismantling the villain's army bit by bit. Soon their reputation becomes an asset that does some of the work for them, kind of like the many cities that yielded to Alexander the Great without a fight when his fierce legend grew. When ESTPs spend too much time thinking about the grand sweeping plans and the big picture, although they can do it fine, it becomes stressful for them, since it all feels so intangible and barely real. So an ESTP archetype is highly likely to be someone whose primary focus is on the next obstacle, the next challenge or battle that's on their path. ISTP, the anti-hero. There's a few types who could have earned this title, but on balance, I found it most applicable to ISTPs. In this sense, the archetype of the ISTP is easy to track across their heroic and villainous incarnations. Either they're going to be in the mold of the sellsword, gun for hire, or mercenary that stay in that role, i.e. more villainous, or they get drawn into the story and begin fighting for or with the good guys. An example of a character who sits right in the middle of this continuum is Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name, that he played in many of the spaghetti western films. He's the main character, but he's not particularly perched on some moral high ground. He's just a better gunslinger than the rest of them. He has that neutrality or ambivalence that often characterizes this archetype. Then you have someone like Han Solo, who initially is just kind of doing his own thing, being a smuggler and semi-criminal. He's out for his own self-interest. Then gradually becomes embroiled in the bigger story, and he feels that pull towards the, well, light side, literally. There's plenty of examples, of course, of firmly and undeniably heroic ISTPs, but I do think it's characteristic of this archetype to often dance that line of being anti-heroes. ISFJ, the hidden hero. Like many personality types, ISFJs get kind of slept on, and not in the fun way. This tends to show up in fiction as well, where ISFJs tend not to be the centerpiece. ISFJs are typically behind-the-scenes kinds of people. Or should I say, they're happy to be in that role and don't see it as a compromise, in the way that other types might. The character of Samwise from Lord of the Rings strikes me as a great example of this archetype. He exists in a supporting role, but as time goes on, it becomes ever more clear that he is essential for the entire plan and story to work, regardless of whether people even realize that to begin with. His steadfastness, loyalty, dependability, toughness, and faith in people make him a quietly formidable character. There's a fantastic part of the story where Sam actually carries the ring, and it doesn't seem to affect him. Now, this is actually ambiguous because he doesn't carry it for a very long time, and his stated desire to share or remove the burden of carrying the ring from Frodo might be more sinister than altruistic. Maybe the ring has already started to corrupt him into wanting it for himself. Or maybe the ring is just more prudent and wants to find its way back to someone who's already been corrupted, rather than starting from scratch. After all, it takes a lot of time and effort to corrupt someone. So I've heard. However, I'm going to be idealistic here and say that it shows that Sam, as a character, displays that incorruptibility that I associate with the ISFJ archetype. Captain America might be another good example of an ISFJ hero, someone who's self-sacrificing, concerned with togetherness, and upholding certain values and ways of being. Even though he's literally the leader of the Avengers, he's still very much in that role of supporting other people. Again, if you wanted to shake things up and not fall into underestimating ISFJs, then create an ISFJ main character and give them top billing. ESFJs, the stewards. ESFJs as an archetype are defenders and protectors of people. They also make excellent leaders for a variety of reasons. One is simply that they enjoy people, love to entertain them, and bring them together. The other is that they can also manage disputes and disagreements between people and mediate very well. When thinking about archetypes, it's always important and useful to think about what conflicts they might experience often. What will be a difficult situation for them to contend with? One of the best ones I can think of for a dramatic narrative when it comes to ESFJs is having situations where both options are bad ones. Basically a dilemma. If not bad, then possessing big drawbacks that hurt people. This thought actually occurred to me with the character of Vander from Arcane. He struck me as being a high FE type, despite the fact that I've seen him typed as an ISTP quite often. I'm not sure what I think about that typing. I imagined how painful it would be for a high FE type, even an FE dom, to be in his position. In the name of the greater good, you constantly have to be confronted by the fact that the people around you disagree with your approach and don't really understand and accept why you're making those kinds of compromises and concessions in the name of social harmony and stability. Partially it's because they haven't experienced the things that you have and seen the things you've seen from your personal experience, which is something that ESFJs take great stock in and value. But in his specific case, it's also because the people around him have different values. To quote a well-known phrase, they would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. So he's torn. He thinks he knows what's right, but at the same time, it makes everyone unhappy, which is a really bad position in terms of personal pain for a high FE type to be in, especially an ESFJ. Seeing an ESFJ have to navigate that is very compelling indeed. ESFJs are actually types that make fantastic characters because of their flexibility. I can picture them being leaders, fighters, creatives. There's many areas for them. The issues they'll run into will come down to missing certain patterns or seeing the bigger picture. Despite their immense capability when it comes to political maneuvering, they might still get caught out by the more Machiavellian people around them, who are always plotting and scheming. ENTJ, the exiled king or queen. One image that comes to mind with an ENTJ protagonist is of someone who formerly held a position of power but was unfairly ousted. Now they must walk among the common folk and rebuild, retool, return to power, and reclaim their throne. I think it was Michael Pierce who described ENTJs as possessing a regal quality in this way. A fictional example would be the main character from the film Gladiator. He clearly carries himself as a leader, even when his station no longer warrants that presumption. He's possessed of an immense self-belief, is planning long-term, whilst also navigating and adapting to the sheer chaos of the situations he finds himself in. He's driven by quietly but firmly held values and principles. Another archetype, in a similar kind of vein, is a revolutionary leader. Someone who is organizing previously disconnected groups and factions and unifying them under the banner of superior strategic thinking and vision. Inevitably, an ENTJ hero is going to be someone with a plan, something to aim for and conquer. INTJ, the Stoic. I think that Andy Dufresne from The Shawshank Redemption is an excellent example of this archetype for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's the cliche of him having a mind-blowingly long-term plan that he quietly and diligently pursues, all the while somewhat basking in his secret brilliance. But secondly, and much more importantly, it's his stoicism in the face of such brutal injustice. He is an innocent man who's been sent to a hellish situation. Yet, his approach isn't to complain or rail against the unfairness of it all. Instead, he plans, strategizes, goes about his business with a methodical and pragmatic mindset that catches everyone off guard. Precisely because it's so difficult to imagine. It has the appearance of being almost inhuman, but it's just the opposite. It's a triumph of human capability. I think that ability to meet difficulty and hardship with that stoic mindset is an essential aspect of the INTJ archetype. It's an apparently cold, detached nature which conceals a willpower that can only be fueled by smouldering passion and emotion. The INTJ archetype is also flexible in terms of whether they're going to be independent or in a position of leadership. They can function equally well in both roles. ISFP, the reluctant hero. The image that springs to mind is of a person thrust into a situation where they are now forced into action. They have to make decisions with high stakes and consequences. In many ways, ISFPs are actually the ideal type to be a hero protagonist. There's a few reasons for this. The things they struggle with, namely being ultra-organized, playing the game of strategy, politics, and power, create fantastic dramatic situations because when they find themselves there, they're kind of like a fish out of water. Then, with their strengths, adaptability, being unshakable in their principles, and possessing an immense willpower and forcefulness, when they want to summon it up, they can fight back against those things. Think of someone like Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, the show and not the books. He is constantly being put in positions of leadership that he didn't ask for or even desire. More than that, he's quite uncomfortable in those roles. He would prefer most of the time to just be doing his own thing and living life on his own terms. Also, ISFPs prefer to respect others in that way as well, and let them do their own thing, without wanting to exercise control over them, hence why leadership can often be such a conflicting thing for them. So this archetype of the reluctant hero, or reluctant leader, matches up really well with ISFPs in my view. ESFPs, the warrior. An excellent example of an ESFP, or at the very least this archetype, is the character of Uhtred from the show The Last Kingdom. There's a fantastic archetypical dynamic between him and King Alfred, who I think is probably an INTJ. Alfred has a vision for a unified England, which includes finally vanquishing their Viking foes. He's largely operating in the realm of political maneuvering, long-term strategizing, and making decisions that affect an entire nation. He's a deep thinker about everything. Then you have Uhtred, who is impulsive, highly emotional, fiery, hot-blooded, and hot-tempered. But he's the man on the ground, in the thick of things. He is, one brutal battle at a time, bringing into existence that vision. Without him, it would be nothing more than a dream. There's a really beautiful poster for the show that I saw once. If I can find it, I'll put it on the screen actually. It has Alfred up the top, looking down on the chessboard, and Uhtred mid-fight. It sums up that archetypical dynamic really nicely. The guy trying to pull the strings, with the vision, and the guy on the ground level, actually putting things into practice. Uhtred has quite a few essential elements of what I think makes a great ESFP hero. Despite the fact that he is, in many ways, completely torn in terms of his loyalties, and constantly has to choose between bad options, and make pragmatic decisions that will hurt or offend at least some side, he manages nonetheless to stay true to himself. That is one of the paradoxical features of ESFPs. They can often be chaotic and all over the shop, yet there is this thread or through line of consistency where they are still fundamentally themselves and authentic. He's willing to take great risks for individuals, has a lot of faith in people and gives them the benefit of the doubt, and is deeply driven by what he believes in. Definitely an excellent representation of an ESFP hero in my view. This video is sponsored by You're My Type, an app that makes finding friends and dating more meaningful by using personality types to match people. Check it out if you want to connect, chat, and meet with people, or just enjoy the memes. It's available on both iOS and Android, and is completely free to download. ENFP, the eternal optimist. A word that comes to mind when thinking about both of the NE DOMs is optimism. It's almost an inherent property of the function of NE. Even if an ENFP might be in a period of their life where they're feeling more cynical, the way they think about the world and the way they approach it will have this optimism and lust for or belief in potential baked into it. There is an ideational energeticness to them. They're also going to be fairly light-hearted, mischievous, clumsy, or fumbling in a broad sense, but undeniably brilliant, and underneath the sometimes silly persona, compelled deeply by sometimes shockingly high standards in many areas of their life, very commonly high ethical standards as well. They're willing, sometimes too willing, to give people the benefit of the doubt, and believe in the fundamental redeemability of humans, probably animals as well. That's certainly something that makes for very dramatic situations in stories, where bets they make on the fundamental goodness of people both pays off and backfires in equal measure. INFP, the individualist. A character that instantly comes to mind is Luke Skywalker. When you first meet him, he feels that what he wants from life is out there somewhere, but he doesn't know how to get there or how to best go about finding it, or finding himself, for that matter. He has that lust for adventure, and his imagination far exceeds his day-to-day life, at least initially. He is characterized by, and I think the INFP archetype is similarly characterized by, an unfailing faith in people, including in his case, the belief that the most, or maybe the second most, evil person in the galaxy is actually redeemable. He's someone who brings down an entire empire with an idea. Another character is Winston Smith, the main protagonist from 1984. He's someone who, in true archetypical INFP fashion, resists and is burdened by the oppressive nature of homogenization, standardization, and the stamping out of individuality. It's that motif of being the lone individual voice, fighting against being a cog in an uncaring machine. I think it's important when trying to capture the INFP archetype that they go on a journey of trying to find their place in the world, or in the galaxy, as the case may be. They somehow retain that misfit spirit innately, which makes them both alienated in some ways, but afforded a unique perspective also. Like with all characters and archetypes, it's important to capture any conflict within them, but especially in the case of INFPs, I believe. They seem to be characterized by that, even more than most. ISTJ, the standard bearer. ISTJ heroes will be driven by an inherent sense of justice, a fundamental belief about the way things should be, on topics of fairness, responsibility, and duty. Loyalty will be a huge non-negotiable thing for them. They are people who are unwilling to budge an inch on matters of principle and character. I think that Ned Stark is an iconic example that comes to mind. He's someone who's respected as a person and as a leader because he lives by his own standards. He practices what he preaches, thereby avoiding any charges of self-righteousness or hypocrisy. He's a standard bearer for a certain way of living, albeit somewhat rigid and unmoving in his views. Any heroic ISTJ archetype would be in line with this, and importantly, will have moments where they pay the price for standing on principle, especially when dealing with the more morally flexible political game players of the world. They need to suffer some of the consequences of being honorable, otherwise it wouldn't be admirable. So an ISTJ hero would be a strange blend of being rigid, unmoving, sometimes even annoying to the people around them, but also ultimately very respected by those same people. ESTJ, the captain. ESTJs are going to be quite similar to ISTJs in their vibe, but will be more likely to find themselves in positions of leadership and command in whatever form that may take. An example of this archetype that comes to mind is Princess Leia from Star Wars. She is a commander who leads from the front and is more than happy to get her hands dirty on the ground level. She's blunt, forceful, aggressive, pragmatic, and no nonsense. In that sense, she's a really interesting mirror for Vader as an opposing general in the war. In the previous video on villainous versions of each type, I think I described ESTJs as a hybrid between ISTJs and ENTJs. This is because ESTJs are actually a difficult type to describe. They have an interesting balance of traits. They are totally fine with creative and innovative solutions to things, and even taking risks when needed. But they're still going to be efficient, effective, and relentless in actually getting the job done. The easiest aspect of them to describe in stereotypical terms is how they are with people. Because they're such big characters and forceful personalities, not in a malicious way, but just by the sheer energy and power of their presence. They are people who have an opinion on how things should be done, and are more than happy to be the people to make it happen. INFJ, the secretive mentor. I've spoken about this notion before with INFJs, but there's this recurring theme in fiction of them being a powerful character in the story, often more powerful than the main hero, yet they occupy a mentor's position. They are guiding the hero, steering them with knowledge and wisdom. This INFJ archetypical character will often be reluctant to get too involved. Maybe that's because they've been down certain paths before, power-hungry paths, and they know the dangers and pitfalls of it. They help formulate plans behind the scenes. They exert a subtle but undeniable influence over the course of events in the story. The example who springs to mind is Dumbledore. What I find interesting is how over the course of the story, he goes from being a warm and cuddly character to someone who's more pragmatic, colder, and rational in his planning. Maybe that's because, as time goes on, the perspective of the main characters goes from that of children to adults, with more understanding of the sometimes brutal compromises involved. I think that it's also instructive when it comes to INFJs though. It's that combination of warm and empathic, yet also surprisingly cold and rational at times as well. It's not a slight against a type to say that they are often better in a supporting role, but that's often very true for INFJs, for reasons I've gone into in many videos. ENFJ, the charismatic. There's a reason for the stereotype of ENFJs being great potential cult leaders. It's because people are drawn to them and want to follow them. It's people skills, charm, and charisma. Similarly, on the side of the angels, ENFJs are going to have the same skill set, just directed towards more noble outcomes. One thing that I think is overlooked with ENFJs is their versatility with people. They can talk in a very grounded, straightforward, concrete, and day-to-day way, if that's what the person they're dealing with is receptive to. Or they can be visionary and dance in the realm of ideas if that's what's needed. A character that comes to mind is Morpheus from The Matrix. He has the unenviable task of having to explain to someone that everything about their reality has been a lie. Not only this, but that there is a much bigger picture and goal. He does this with an amazing amount of style, slowly guiding both Neo and the audience through the philosophical minefield of what's happening. He's quite singular in his vision, takes responsibility for bringing that into existence, and also takes responsibility for guiding much of the community of Zion as well. He's someone who is an astonishing orator, a visionary, someone with a plan, but also adaptability, who is a leader of people. His communication style is also interesting. As is characteristic of the ENFJ archetype, his preference is not to make the logical case for something, but rather the emotional one. That's his route to inspiring and motivating others. ENTP, the rebel with a cause. Eventually. For any ENTP who has watched this video in full and in order, they will probably be annoyed that they didn't get the title of anti-hero, and they would be quite justified in feeling that way. Often the ENTP hero archetype will be someone who at first is just out to have fun and satisfy their ravenous curiosity. Then eventually, they'll show themselves to be deeply moral and possessing strong character. It's not that ENTPs often have a front to them, even though that does feel like a somewhat accurate description. If you think of that scene from the first Avengers film between Captain America and Tony Stark, where Cap says that he doesn't think that Tony is someone who would make the sacrifice play to lay down on a wire and let the other guy crawl over you. Stark responds by saying, "I think I would just cut the wire." Then Cap says, "Always a way out." This moment captures the vibe of ENTPs very well. They would rather go for the funny quip or one-liner or comeback as opposed to responding seriously, even though on a deep level they actually disagree with what's being said. He is someone who is willing to sacrifice, and does. But in the moment, ENTPs will usually think, why should I justify myself to this person? I'm just going to annoy them instead. So the ENTP archetype is certainly not going to be the conventional hero. Another heroic ENTP archetype would be the more bright-eyed and naive version. Someone who wants to change everything with their brilliant ideas, but then has to contend with the realities of implementing those ideas. INTP, the intellectual. It's a great recipe for drama if an INTP character is thrown into the thick of things, having to wrestle with the chaos of an adventure. They're typically going to prefer to be in their cave, working on the projects that interest them. As an archetype, they need a certain amount of time and space and even solitude to do the deep work that they desire. As a hero archetype, they're typically going to be people who transcend their limitations in certain areas with their creativity and brain power. I think one of the most extreme and abstract or philosophical examples is Neo from The Matrix. It's extreme because his physical prowess comes from his mind. To be powerful in The Matrix is primarily a mental endeavor. Just from analysis and deep thinking, he manages to literally deconstruct his reality and question it fundamentally. I've mentioned this before, but INTPs are often interested in sport and martial arts, and I don't think that should be a surprising thing. Understanding the underlying patterns and structures, then applying them creatively is the name of the game, and that's very well suited to the natural INTP skill set. So it's entirely possible to have an INTP hero who's known for their physical mastery and prowess. But generally, it's going to be more focused on their intellect because that's the source of their power. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and feel free to check out the Love Who Discord server. The link is down below in the description.